the crystal chandelier caught the light of 1,000 diamonds the moment Richard Harrington raised his champagne glass and laughed a sharp, cutting sound that sliced through the orchestra's gentle melody. As he pointed at the small figure standing near the marble fountain, a girl no older than 12, in a faded yellow dress and worn sneakers, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and he said loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "You don't belong here." Words that hung in the air like poison, while her wide brown eyes met his for just a second before she looked down at the floor. But she didn't leave. And that was the beginning of everything that would unravel Richard's carefully constructed world. The Grand Harrington Hotel, Richard's crown jewel, and the venue for tonight's annual Millionaire's charity gala, gleamed with opulence, marble floors polished to mirrors, walls draped in silk, tables laden with delicacies most people only saw in magazines, and Richard himself, 52 years old with silver hair, perfectly styled, and a custom Italian suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and admiration like a king among his court. His wife Vanessa at his side, in a gown that sparkled like starlight, their whole life a testament to success, power, and the distance he'd placed between himself and the poverty of his childhood, a past he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it never existed. The girl, whose name he didn't know and didn't care to know, had somehow slipped past security, and Richard had noticed her immediately. She stood out like a smudge on a perfect painting, watching the guests with curious eyes, her small hands clasped in front of her, and when she'd reached out to touch one of the floral arrangements, Richard had swooped in with his mocking comment, satisfied when she withdrew her hand, though bothered when she still didn't leave. Instead, moving to a corner near the coat check, where she sat on a small bench, just watching, waiting for something he couldn't understand. Throughout the evening, as Richard networked and schmoozed with tech moguls, real estate tycoons, and entertainment executives, he kept catching glimpses of the girl. Once he saw her helping an elderly woman who'd dropped her purse, gathering the scattered contents with careful hands. Another time she was offering a handkerchief to a waiter who'd burned his finger on a serving dish. Later she was sitting beside a young boy who appeared to be crying, the son of one of the guests, speaking to him softly, until he smiled, and each time Richard saw her, he felt an inexplicable irritation, a tightness in his chest he couldn't name, as if her very presence was challenging something fundamental about the world he'd built. "Someone should call security," he muttered to Vanessa during dinner, nodding toward where the girl now sat on the grand staircase. But Vanessa, distracted by a conversation about a charity auction, barely acknowledged him. And when Richard finally flagged down his head of security, Marcus, a tall man with kind eyes, who'd worked for Richard for 15 years, Marcus said something that surprised him. "Sir, she's not causing any harm, and honestly, she's been helping people all evening. I've been watching her. Maybe we should just let her be." Richard's face flushed with anger at being questioned, but before he could respond, the evening's main event began, the charity presentation, where Richard would announce this year's cause and accept applause for his generosity, a performance he'd perfected over the years. The benevolent billionaire giving back, though the truth was the tax benefits were substantial, and the actual percentage of his wealth he donated was minimal, something he never let himself think about too carefully. The lights dimmed and a spotlight hit the stage as Richard walked up to the podium, the crowd of 300 guests falling silent, their faces turned toward him in anticipation, and he launched into his rehearsed speech about the importance of giving back, about how blessed they all were, about responsibility and community. Words that sounded noble, but felt hollow in his own mouth, though he'd said them so many times they came automatically now. And he was midway through, announcing that this year's beneficiary would be the City Children's Medical Center, when he saw her again. The girl had moved closer to the stage, standing at the very edge of the crowd, and she was crying, silent tears streaming down her face as she listened to him talk about sick children and medical care and hope. And something about those tears, about the raw emotion on her young face, made Richard stumble over his words, lose his place in the speech, have to glance down at his notes to continue. And for the first time in years, he felt something crack in the armor he wore, just a hairline fracture, but enough to let in a sliver of something uncomfortable, something real. After the presentation, as guests mingled and the orchestra resumed playing, Richard found himself searching for the girl, telling himself he was going to have her removed once and for all, but also propelled by a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. And he found her in the hotel's grand library, a room most guests ignored, standing in front of a large photograph on the wall, a black and white image from 35 years ago, showing the hotel's original opening, and in the corner of that photograph, barely visible, was a young boy, maybe 10 years old, in oversized donated clothes, holding a broom, his face thin with hunger, but his eyes bright with determination. And Richard's breath caught because that boy was him, a version of himself he'd tried to forget. The poor kid who'd begged for a job sweeping floors, who'd slept in a shelter, who'd eaten from trash cans, who'd clawed his way up from nothing with ruthless ambition and a willingness to leave behind anyone who reminded him of weakness, including his own history. "That's you, isn't it?" the girl said softly, not looking at him but knowing he was there. And Richard wanted to deny it, to lie, to maintain the facade. But something in her voice so gentle, so knowing made him whisper, "Yes," and she finally turned to face him, those brown eyes full of wisdom beyond her years. And she said, "My grandmother told me about you. She said you used to be kind, that you were different before you became rich. She said you forgot where you came from," and Richard felt his heart begin to pound, a sense of dread and recognition mixing together, and he asked, "Who is your grandmother?" Though part of him already knew, already felt the threads of the past. Pulling tight, the girl reached into her small worn purse and pulled out an old photograph, its edges soft with age, and handed it to Richard, and he found himself staring at an image he hadn't seen in decades, himself, at 16, skinny and desperate, standing next to a middle-aged woman outside a soup kitchen, and the woman was smiling, her arm around his shoulders. And he remembered her instantly, Alina Rodriguez, the kindest person he'd ever known, the volunteer who'd not only fed him but had believed in him, who'd helped him study for his GED, who'd lent him money for his first business suit, who'd told him he could be anything he wanted. But to never forget that success without compassion was just another form of poverty. And Richard had promised her he'd remember, had sworn he'd be different from all the rich people who'd looked down on him. But somewhere along the way, year by year, deal by deal, he'd let that promise dissolve, had let himself become exactly what he'd once despised. "Your grandmother is Elena?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. And the girl nodded. Her name was Alina. "Yes, she passed away 3 months ago," and the word was hit Richard like a physical blow, stealing his breath, because Alina had been the closest thing to family he'd had during those desperate years. And he'd abandoned her, had stopped visiting once his business took off, had sent money a few times in the early years, but then even that stopped, had been too busy, too important, too eager to forget the soup kitchens and shelters, and everything they represented. And now she was gone, and he'd never said thank you, never said goodbye, never kept his promise. The girl continued, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. "Grandma Alina raised me after my parents died, and even when she got sick, even when we had almost nothing, she would tell me stories about the people she'd helped, especially about you. About the scared teenager who had fire in his eyes and dreams bigger than his circumstances. And she'd say that she hoped you found success, but that she worried you might lose yourself in it. And when she was in the hospital at the end, she made me promise to do something for her. She wanted me to come here, to this gala, to see you, to remind you of who you used to be. Because she never stopped believing that the kind boy she knew was still in there somewhere beneath all the wealth and walls. and Richard felt something breaking inside him. All the defenses and justifications and careful compartmentalization crumbling, and he sank into one of the library's leather chairs, suddenly feeling every one of his 52 years, feeling the weight of decades of choices that had led him away from the person he'd meant to be. "She wanted you to see me?" Richard asked, looking up at this extraordinary girl who'd endured his mockery and cruelty with grace, who'd spent the evening helping others despite being treated as an outsider, who carried her grandmother's love like a torch in the darkness, and the girl nodded. She said that sometimes people need a mirror held up to their past to remember their future. I didn't really understand what she meant, but she told me to come here, to not leave even if people were unkind, to just be present and be helpful. And she said that if you were truly lost, you wouldn't notice me at all, but if there was still hope, you'd see me, really see me, and you'd remember. And Richard realized with a shock that everything that had irritated him about her presence all evening, the way she didn't belong, the way she helped others, the way she persisted, despite his cruelty, all of it had been a mirror, showing him exactly what he'd become and what he'd lost. And he'd been seeing it all along, but refusing to recognize it until this moment. The sounds of the gala continued outside the library, laughter and music, and the clinking of expensive glasses. But in this quiet room, Richard felt like he was being unmade and remade simultaneously. Every memory he'd suppressed flooding back, the hunger, the fear, the loneliness, but also the kindness of strangers, the power of someone believing in you, the dreams he'd had, not just of being rich, but of being good, of being someone who lifted others up the way Alina had lifted him. And he'd achieved the wealth beyond his wildest childhood imaginings, but abandoned everything else. And sitting before him was the granddaughter of his greatest benefactor, a girl he'd mocked and dismissed. And the shame was overwhelming, crushing. And Richard put his face in his hands, and for the first time in 30 years, he wept, deep sobs that came from a place he'd locked away. And he felt the girl's small hand on his shoulder, offering comfort he didn't deserve, and that kindness undid him even further. Through his tears, Richard began to speak, words tumbling out unplanned and raw. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I forgot. I'm sorry I abandoned her. I'm sorry I became this person. I don't even know who I am anymore. I've spent so long building walls and chasing more and proving I was better than my past, that I lost everything that mattered. And your grandmother Alina, she was the only one who saw me when I was invisible, who treated me like I had value when the world said I was worthless. And I repaid her by disappearing, by being too important to remember where I came from. And tonight I looked at you and saw someone who didn't belong, and I was cruel because you reminded me, of the part of myself I've been running from. And she sent you here knowing exactly what would happen, knowing that I needed to face this. And oh God, I wish I could tell her I'm sorry. I wish I could thank her. I wish I could go back and be the person she believed I could be." And the words kept coming. A confession and a grief and awakening all mixed together. And the girl listened with the same patient kindness her grandmother must have shown. And when Richard finally fell silent, exhausted and emptied, she said something that would stay with him forever. "Grandma said that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be, that every moment is a chance to choose differently. And she wanted you to know that she never stopped loving you like a son, and she forgave you a long time ago. But she wanted you to forgive yourself and start again." Richard looked at this wise, beautiful soul, this girl whose name he still didn't know, but who had traveled across the city to this gala, who had endured his mockery and the stares of wealthy strangers, who had carried out her dying grandmother's final wish with such grace and courage. And he asked, "What's your name?" And she smiled, a smile that reminded him achingly of Alina, and said, "My name is Hope, Hope Rodriguez." And Richard almost laughed at the perfect poetry of it, that Alina had sent him someone named Hope to pull him back from the edge of his own emptiness. And he asked, "Hope, what happens now?" Your grandmother brought me here to this moment, but what am I supposed to do with it? And Hope looked around the library, then back at him, and said, I think you already know. I think you've always known. Grandma said that you are smart and strong and capable of amazing things. So do amazing things, but this time do them for the right reasons. Do them the way you would have wanted someone to do them for you when you were young and scared and hungry. And in that moment, Richard made a decision, not a small one or a symbolic one, but a fundamental reordering of his priorities and his life. And he stood up, wiped his eyes, and said, Will you come with me? I need to do something and I need you to witness it, to hold me accountable, the way your grandmother would have. And Hope nodded and took his hand, and together they walked out of the library and back into the glittering gala. The guests were surprised when Richard returned to the stage. No announcement planned, the evening's program already complete. But Richard took the microphone and the room fell silent, and instead of the polished businessman, they saw someone different, someone vulnerable and raw. And Richard began to speak, not from notes, but from his heart. I need to tell you all something, and I need to make some changes right now, tonight, because I've just been reminded of something I should never have forgotten. I grew up in poverty. I was homeless as a teenager. I survived because of the kindness of people who had every reason to ignore me, but chose to help. And somewhere along the way to building this empire, I forgot that. I forgot what it feels like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be told you don't belong. And tonight I said those exact words to someone, to a young girl who had more right to be here than any of us. And I'm ashamed, and I'm sorry, and I'm going to do better. And the room was utterly silent. 300 wealthy people, frozen in shock at this unprecedented confession. And Richard continued. The charity donation I announced earlier was $500,000 to the Children's Medical Center. And that's good, but it's not enough. It's not even close to enough. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm pledging $10 million to the hospital, and another $10 million to create a foundation in honor of Elena Rodriguez, a woman who saved my life and countless others through simple acts of kindness. And this foundation will provide education, housing support, and job training for homeless youth. And it will be run with input from people who actually understand poverty, not just people like me who've forgotten it. And furthermore, I'm committing to spending one day every week volunteering, actually showing up and doing the work, not just writing checks. And I'm going to start living like I actually believe that every person has value, not just the ones who can afford to be in rooms like this. The silence stretched for a moment longer, and then someone began to clap, and then someone else. And then the entire room erupted in applause. But Richard wasn't doing this for applause. He was doing it because a 12-year-old girl named Hope had been brave enough to carry out her grandmother's dying wish, and because he'd finally looked in the mirror and been horrified by what he'd become, and because it was never too late to change, never too late to honor the people who'd lifted you up, never too late to become who you were meant to be. And as the applause continued, Richard looked down at Hope standing in the front row, and she was smiling with tears streaming down her face, and Richard knew that somewhere, somehow, Elena knew, and maybe, just maybe, she was proud of him again. After the gala ended, and the last guests departed, Richard sat with Hope in the hotel's all-night cafe, and over hot chocolate hers, with extra marshmallows, his black coffee. They talked for hours. And Richard learned that Hope and Elena had been living in a small apartment in the old neighborhood, the same area where Richard had once struggled, that they'd been barely getting by on Elena's small pension, that Hope was in 7th grade and loved reading and mathematics, that she dreamed of becoming a teacher, that she'd been taking care of her grandmother through the illness, cooking and cleaning and helping with medications, that she was currently staying with a neighbor but would need to figure out permanent arrangements soon since she had no other family. And as Richard listened, he felt the full weight of what Elena had done with so little, while he'd done so little with so much. And he made another decision, one he discussed first with Vanessa when he got home in the early morning hours, and to his surprise, his wife, who'd been growing increasingly distant and unhappy in their empty, opulent life, responded with the first real enthusiasm he'd seen from her in years. And together they agreed that they wanted to offer Hope something meaningful, not charity but family. And after working with social services and attorneys over the following weeks, Richard and Vanessa became Hope's legal guardians, and she moved into one of the guest rooms of their penthouse, though Richard immediately asked her to help redecorate it to feel less like a museum and more like a home. And slowly, piece by piece, the Harrington household began to transform. Hope's presence changed everything in ways both small and profound. Her laughter echoed in halls that had been silent too long. Her questions challenged assumptions Richard had stopped examining. Her simple habits of kindness and gratitude reminded both Richard and Vanessa of what mattered, and she had a way of cutting through pretension and pointing out truth that was both uncomfortable and necessary. And Richard found himself not just tolerating it but craving it, needing that honesty like oxygen after years of being surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. And he kept his promises from that gala night, every single one, establishing the Alina Rodriguez Foundation with Hope as a junior board member whose voice carried real weight, committing serious resources, not just money, but time and attention, showing up every Tuesday to volunteer at the youth shelter, learning the names and stories of kids who reminded him of who he'd been, and using his business connections not just to enrich himself, but to create job opportunities and mentorship programs for young people aging out of the foster system or struggling with homelessness. And it was hard work, harder than closing business deals, because it required emotional presence and vulnerability and facing painful truths about systemic inequality and his own complicity in it. But it was also the most meaningful work he'd ever done, and for the first time in decades, Richard felt like he was building something that mattered, not just accumulating wealth, but creating actual change. And the irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent 30 years climbing away from poverty only to discover that his most important work would be climbing back down to help others up. Vanessa, too, found new purpose, getting involved with the Foundation's education initiatives, using her own abandoned degree in child psychology to develop programs. And the marriage that had been slowly dying in a desert of dinner parties and social climbing began to bloom again, watered by shared purpose and the presence of a child who needed them and somehow also saved them. And they would never be perfect, would never erase the years of shallow choices and missed opportunities. But they were genuinely trying, genuinely changing, and that counted for something, maybe for everything. 1 year after that transformative gala, Richard stood in the same ballroom, hosting another event. But this one was different half. The guests were from the usual wealthy circles, but the other half were youth from the Foundation's programs. Scholarship recipients, former homeless teens, now in college or job training, volunteers and social workers, and people who'd dedicated their lives to helping others. And there was no separation between them, no VIP section or hierarchy, just people coming together. And Richard watched as a tech CEO talked with a young woman who'd lived in her car 6 months ago, but was now studying nursing. As a real estate mogul listened intently to a former foster youth explain the gaps in the system. As Hope, now 13, and growing more confident and radiant every day, moved through the crowd, introducing people and building bridges, doing exactly what her grandmother had done, seeing people and connecting them and believing in possibility. And Richard felt a fullness in his chest that he'd never experienced in all his years of success, a sense of alignment between who he was and who he wanted to be. And he knew he still had so far to go, knew he'd still mess up and fall short and struggle with the impulses toward pride and self-protection. But he also knew he was on the right path now, finally, and that Elena's final gift to him, sending Hope to hold up that mirror, had quite literally saved his life. or at least save the part of his life that made it worth living. As the evening wound down, and Richard stood at the same spot where he'd once mocked a girl in a faded yellow dress, Hope approached him, now wearing a new dress but still with her hair in that same simple braid, still with those wise brown eyes. And she handed him something, a letter, yellowed with age, in an envelope with his name on it, in handwriting he recognized instantly as Elena's. And Hope said, "Grandma wrote this years ago, and told me to give it to you after the first foundation gala. She said you'd be ready to read it by then." And Richard's hands trembled as he opened it, and Elena's words flowed over him like a blessing. "Dear Richard, if you're reading this, then my Hope found you and reminded you of who you really are. And I'm so proud of you, not for being rich or successful, but for being brave enough to change, to admit you'd lost your way, and to choose a different path that takes more courage than building an empire ever did. And I want you to know that I never stopped believing in you, even when you stopped believing in yourself. Even when years passed and I didn't hear from you, because I knew that the boy I met all those years ago, the one with fire and dreams and a good heart, was still in there somewhere. And people don't fundamentally change, they just sometimes forget, and forget, and forget, until someone reminds them. And I knew Hope could be that reminder, because she has the same gift I had, the gift of seeing people as they really are, and as they could be, not as the world has labeled them. And I'm asking you to take care of her, not just with money or opportunities, but with love and presence, and by being the kind of person she can look up to. And I'm asking you to take care of yourself too, to forgive yourself for the years you spent lost, to understand that every moment is a new chance, and to remember that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give, who you lift up, how much love you let in and let out. And you have so much to give, Richard, so much potential, not just for wealth, but for goodness. And I hope you'll use it. I hope you'll be the man I always knew you could be. And I hope you'll tell Hope stories about me, and keep my memory alive, but also help her build her own story, one full of possibility and purpose. And know that I loved you like a son, always did, always will. And I'm so grateful our paths crossed all those years ago, outside that soup kitchen, because you brought joy to my life too. You reminded me why the work mattered, and watching you survive and dream gave me hope, even in hard times. So thank you, Richard. Thank you for being part of my story. And please know that wherever I am, I'm cheering for you, believing in you, and so very proud of the choice you made to come back to yourself with love, always, Elena." And by the time Richard finished reading, he was crying again. But these were different tears, not tears of shame and regret, but of gratitude and resolution. And he pulled Hope into a hug, and Vanessa joined them. And the three of them stood there in that glittering ballroom that represented everything Richard had built with his ambition, and everything he was rebuilding with his heart. And he understood finally that belonging isn't about money or status or the right clothes or the right connections, that the girl in the faded yellow dress had belonged there more than anyone because she carried with her the truth of what mattered, and that he'd spent so many years trying to escape the vulnerability of his past, when what he should have been doing was honoring it, learning from it, using it to stay human and connected and real. And that the greatest wealth isn't in bank accounts or real estate portfolios, but in the lives you touch, the people you help, the love you choose to give and receive. And that sometimes the most important thing a millionaire can hear is "you don't belong here," spoken by his own mouth to his own mirror. Because only in recognizing how lost he'd become could he find his way home. And home, he now understood, wasn't a penthouse or a hotel empire, but was this standing with people he loved, honoring someone who'd believed in him, working toward something bigger than himself. And finally, after so many years of running and climbing and building walls, letting himself be found,